Whispers of a Lost Empire. Imagine for a moment standing before a vast yellowing map of the world printed in Amsterdam in the 17th century. The parchment smells faintly of dust and ink, the kind that lingers in the air of old libraries. Across Eurasia, where today we might expect the familiar sweep of Russia and China, there sprawls instead a word that now feels almost mythical: Tartaria. Bold letters claim an expanse so immense that it dwarfs the nations around it. It is not a small province, nor a forgotten duchy. It is a world-spanning region, said once to have stretched from the Caspian shores to the Pacific waves. Yet today, the word Tartaria has nearly vanished. We do not recite it in our schoolbooks, nor does it appear in most of our encyclopedias. It lingers only as a curious relic, a whisper on maps or in obscure margins of explorers' journals, and in that silence a mystery takes root. What was this so-called super-civilization? Was it truly an empire, advanced beyond our imagining, erased from memory? Or was it nothing more than a cartographic placeholder, a name for lands unknown to Europeans at the time? Mainstream historians often describe Tartary, as it was called in Western tongues, as a geographical blanket term. For them, it denoted the vast, loosely understood territories inhabited by Mongol, Turkic, and nomadic peoples of Central and Northern Asia. Marco Polo, in the 13th century, travelled through parts of this land and filled European imaginations with tales of the Khans, of silk caravans, and of cities glittering on the steppe. By the 16th and 17th centuries, mapmakers began slapping the word Tartaria across their globes. To them, it was less a state and more an enigma, a vastness that lay beyond familiar borders. But in the fringes of historical speculation, another story persists. It suggests that Tartaria was not simply a vague label, but a true empire, perhaps even a civilization whose sophistication rivaled or surpassed our own. Fringe writers imagine flying machines before the Wright brothers, intricate energy systems before the power grid, and grand architecture built on principles we are only beginning to rediscover. If true, such a civilization would upend our very narrative of human progress. Consider the way names vanish. The Roman Empire dissolved, yet Rome still lives on in textbooks, in ruins, in the very architecture of our capitals. The Ottomans collapsed a century ago, and yet the name echoes through our histories of Europe and the Middle East. Tartaria, by contrast, leaves behind no official anthem, no preserved records, no proud descendants declaring themselves Tartarians. It is as though the entire concept was not only forgotten but deliberately erased. Scholars still debate whether this absence is mere coincidence, or the fingerprint of something more intentional, a suppression of memory. And yet, hints remain. The Jesuit missionaries who entered China in the 17th century described vast cities along the steppes, some brimming with towers and strange fortifications. Travellers returning from Siberia wrote of riverside ruins and peoples whose languages were unlike any they had heard before. Even Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, once spoke of the challenge of ruling over lands that, only a generation earlier, were still marked on maps as part of Tartary. There is another layer too, the quirky, almost folkloric tidbits that continue to feed fascination. In the 19th century, for instance, a curious rumour spread among European intellectuals that Tartaria possessed immense machines buried under the earth, designed to harness natural energy. These tales were half dream, half theory, and yet they would later echo eerily with the experiments of Nikola Tesla, who also believed that the earth itself could provide free power. Did he stumble on a rediscovered Tartarian secret, or was the parallel mere coincidence? One cannot help but feel that Tartaria hovers between fact and fable, too slippery to pin down, yet too persistent to dismiss. And so, as we begin this long journey through whispers of maps, architecture, folklore, and theories, we must tread carefully, balancing the mainstream facts against the allure of the forbidden narrative. for it is in this twilight space that the story of Tartaria still breathes, not in the dry lines of official history, but in the imagination of those who look at a blank expanse on an old map and wonder, what if? And perhaps that is the real beginning, not with the ruins or the relics, but with the very act of wonder, to look at an erased name and hear in it the echoes of a lost empire, maps that shouldn't exist. In the dim glow of a museum case, a visitor peers down at a faded sheet of vellum, its edges browned with centuries of handling. The cartographer's strokes are delicate, his ink still holding traces of deep indigo and rusted red. Across the northern sweep of Eurasia, a single word dominates the expanse: Tartaria. It is not a minor annotation, nor tucked discreetly at the edge. It spreads boldly, as though the cartographer had no doubt that this was a coherent place, a civilization worth naming. Old maps are more than just practical guides for travellers. They are mirrors of a world view. They tell us not only where people thought lands and rivers lay, but also what they believed about the cultures, the boundaries, the importance of one realm compared to another. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Tartaria was not a blank space, it was written with conviction. Gerardus Mercator, the great Flemish mapmaker of the 1500s, filled his world atlas with a massive Tartaria spanning half of Asia. Nicolas Sanson of France, a century later, echoed the same, his maps portraying Tartaria stretching from the Caspian to the Pacific, from the icy tundra of the north to the deserts of the south. Mainstream historians tell us why. For Europeans, so far removed from the day-to-day realities of Asia, this label served as a catch-all. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century had shaken the medieval world. Their warriors were often called Tartars, and their dominion across the steppes was vast. So when Renaissance and Enlightenment mapmakers sat at their desks in Amsterdam, Paris, or Venice, they drew a broad region and stamped it with that name. For them, Tartaria meant, here be peoples we do not fully know, here be nomads, here be the vastness beyond. And yet, if we lean closer, there are oddities, details that do not fit neatly into the just. A blank label. Explanation. Some maps delineate Great Tartary from Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary and Muscovite Tartary. These divisions suggest not ignorance but structure, as though the mapmakers believed this land had distinct polities, regions, even administrative systems. Why would they bother to subdivide something they considered vague? Scholars still debate whether these subdivisions reflected real political entities or whether they were simply inventions of European imagination. The quirky layer comes from the so-called phantom maps, those curious charts that show rivers, cities, and entire coastlines which, when compared to modern geography, seem fantastical. On some 17th century maps of Tartary, clusters of cities are drawn in areas we now regard as barren tundra or desert. Were these embellishments, artistic flourishes to fill the emptiness, or did they reflect travellers' tales of lost cities, now buried under mud, snow, or silence? Take, for instance, the Mercator projection of 1595. Nestled among mountains in the far north, he depicted vast rivers flowing from a central polar sea, with Tartarian lands wrapping around it. Later enthusiasts would seize on these images, suggesting that cartographers preserved knowledge of landscapes that no longer exist, perhaps altered by cataclysm. Mainstream geographers dismiss this as error, yet the coincidence of river placements sometimes unsettles even the cautious. There is also the curious matter of the Jesuit maps of China from the 17th century. These were not casual sketches, but the product of painstaking surveys. On them, northern cities, some labelled with strange, now forgotten names, dot the regions once called Tartaria. If the Jesuits recorded them, did they once exist? Or were they mistranslations of local settlements long since absorbed into other states? And so we find ourselves staring at these maps, suspended between possibilities. Perhaps Tartaria was only a convenient European shorthand for "we do not know." Perhaps it was a real polity, its outlines blurred by distance, yet still tangible enough for cartographers to trace. Or perhaps, most tantalizingly, these maps are shadows, records of a civilization erased not only from memory, but from geography itself. If one looks carefully, a pattern emerges. The older the map, the more confidently Tartaria is marked. By the 18th century, as Russia expanded eastward and Britain tightened its grip on India, the label begins to fade. Tartaria shrinks on the page, replaced by the Russian Empire, by Xinjiang, by Mongolia. By the 19th century, it is gone entirely, like ink rubbed out by an invisible hand. And here lies the unsettling question. Did the name vanish simply because empires redefined the boundaries? Or was something else, something larger, being written out of history? Was Tartar either a phantom that never existed or a ghost deliberately silenced? Scholars still debate whether this erasure was natural evolution or something more engineered. The maps remain, mute and fragile, as though daring us to interpret their silence. Architectural echoes. In cities across the world, we sometimes stumble on buildings that feel out of place. A grand stone facade looms in a quiet provincial town. Ornate domes and arches rise where no empire was ever supposed to flourish. Fortifications shaped like stars, geometric perfection carved into earthworks, appear in regions that official history tells us were once backwaters. These structures seem to hum with an energy of their own, whispering of a forgotten hand that designed them. For those who chase the legend of Tartaria, such architecture is the most tangible evidence left behind, a world hiding in plain sight. Mainstream archaeology attributes these buildings to known powers: Renaissance Europe, Imperial Russia, the Ottoman legacy. Many of the great domes and sprawling palaces are recorded as products of colonial wealth or imperial ambition. Take the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, constructed in the mid-1700s under the reign of Elizabeth of Russia, later expanded under Catherine the Great. Its ornate facade, stretching nearly 200 metres, is credited to Italian architects trained in the Baroque style. Yet for Tartarian enthusiasts, this is precisely the puzzle. How could a swampy settlement, scarcely founded by Peter the Great in the early 1700s, so quickly boast architectural achievements rivaling Rome and Paris? Scholars still debate whether this explosion of grandeur can be explained solely by European imports, or whether these palaces were, in fact, older structures inherited and repurposed. Then there are the star forts. From Italy to India, from Siberia to the Americas, vast geometric bastions carved into earth and stone appear, almost identical in design. Triangular bastions, radiating points, symmetrical defences. Engineers say this design was spread by Renaissance military theory, the so-called Trace Italienne style, meant to resist cannon fire. And yet, the sheer number of these forts, scattered in places far removed from European influence, raises questions. How could remote colonies, often supposedly struggling to survive, possess the resources and expertise to create such mathematically perfect constructions? Some whisper that these were not forts at all, but part of an energy grid, machines of earth and geometry that the Tartarians once mastered. Consider also the great domes and spires crowned with metal, often described as lightning rods. Orthodox churches, Ottoman mosques, Catholic cathedrals, all bristle with gilded onion domes and pointed towers. To the mainstream, these are stylistic flourishes, symbols of heavenward aspiration. Yet fringe theorists note their uncanny similarity across continents, suggesting they might once have served as resonant devices. Were they drawing down atmospheric electricity, much like Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower centuries later? The quirky thought persists. Perhaps what we call religious architecture was once part of a global energy system camouflaged under new faiths and rulers. And then the mudflood stories creep in. Walk down into the basements of old buildings in Moscow, Paris, or Istanbul, and one finds windows buried below street level, doors that open onto packed earth. Officially, this is explained as centuries of road raising, rebuilding, and sediment accumulation. But the pattern repeats worldwide: buried first floors, submerged arches, grand columns now serving as foundations. Enthusiasts argue that these are not accidents of urban growth, but remnants of a cataclysm that half-buried an older civilization. The architecture, they say, is Tartarian, still standing, only swallowed halfway by mud. One mainstream fact remains undeniable. The architectural record is astonishing. The Hermitage, the Kremlin's cathedrals, Samarkand's Registan Square, the star forts of India, these exist, vast and breathtaking. Their beauty is not in dispute. The question is whether they represent a chain of local traditions and imported expertise, or whether they are fragments of something unified, something older, something erased. Scholars still debate whether similarities across continents arise from diffusion of European designs, or whether they point to a deeper, forgotten root. Walk into one of these buildings, and the sensation is overwhelming. The echo of footsteps under a dome, the way light filters through stained glass, the strange perfection of symmetry. They feel built for endurance, for grandeur, perhaps even for purposes we no longer understand. They are, quite literally, the architectural echoes of a world we cannot fully place. And it is in these echoes that the idea of Tartaria lingers strongest. A super-civilization leaving fingerprints in stone, hiding in plain sight, its cities now absorbed into modern nations, its legacy reduced to curiosity. To look up at one of these great domes is to wonder whether we are, unknowingly, living in the ruins of a forgotten world. Machines of the sky. Picture a dusky evening on the Eurasian steppe, centuries ago. The wind rushes low across the grass, bending it in rippling waves. Shepherds and traders gather around their fires, and above them, legends say, strange lights move across the sky, too steady to be stars, too deliberate to be fire. Were they comets, atmospheric phenomena, or, as the whispers insist, machines of the air? In the lore of Tartaria, this is where the imagination takes flight, quite literally, with airships, aerial palaces, and technologies that seem centuries ahead of their time. Mainstream historians, of course, are careful here. They remind us that no archaeological evidence exists of functioning airships in antiquity. The first sustained documented flight of a lighter-than-air craft belongs to the Montgolfier brothers in 1783 France. Rigid airships, the Zeppelins, would not appear until the early 1900s. Yet, scattered accounts from explorers and chroniclers hint at earlier visions. In the 17th century, for example, Dutch traders returning from Russia brought back rumours of flying barges sighted in remote regions of Siberia. Later, in the 19th century, curious American newspapers told of airships seen hovering above towns, often described as cigar-shaped, metallic, and sometimes luminous. Scholars still debate whether these were fanciful exaggerations, misidentified natural phenomena, or sincere testimonies of something stranger. For Tartarian enthusiasts, these stories fold into a larger pattern. They argue that the civilization once possessed technologies to master the skies, perhaps vast airships powered not by combustion engines, but by free energy harnessed from the atmosphere. In this vision, domes and spires were not mere religious ornaments, but docking systems or resonant generators feeding power to these craft. It is a fantastical claim, yes, but one fed by a peculiar coincidence. Many 19th century engravings of world expositions, London, Paris, St. Louis, depict balloon-like craft hovering over grand pavilions. Were these artistic flourishes or subtle nods to a suppressed technology? A quirky tidbit emerges from Russian folklore, the tale of Koshchei the Deathless, a figure sometimes described as flying through the air in an iron vessel, carried by mysterious forces. Was this simply metaphor for supernatural ability, or a cultural echo of remembered machines? Across Siberia, shamans spoke of heavenly boats that descended in fire, while in Central Asia, some epics mention rulers who commanded the winds with metal chariots. The line between myth and memory is always difficult to draw. Then there are the mechanical oddities found in unexpected places. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered off the coast of Greece in 1901, predates Tartarian legends by a millennium, but it proves a point. Ancient peoples sometimes built machines far more advanced than we assumed possible. Why then could Tartaria not have harboured similar marvels, ones lost in mud or confiscated in conquest? Enthusiasts point to the perpetual motion machines displayed at early world's fairs, inventions that quickly disappeared from record. Were these rediscoveries of Tartarian principles quickly suppressed once more? Mainstream science remains skeptical, often with good reason. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Archaeologists point to the lack of preserved engines, frameworks, or materials that could credibly sustain flight. Yet the human imagination resists neat dismissal. Scholars still debate whether the recurring descriptions of aerial craft in folklore and 19th century reports reflect collective fantasy or fragments of an old, buried truth. Consider, too, how quickly technologies can vanish. In the 20th century alone, whole branches of engineering, like vacuum tube computing or Zeppelin travel, rose and fell in a matter of decades. Imagine a cataclysm, a mudflood, or an imperial conquest sweeping away a fragile infrastructure. The survivors might remember only stories of vessels that glided above the earth, of towers that hummed with invisible power, of machines that seemed alive. And so, when we walk under the shadow of a cathedral spire, or glance at a woodcut showing a floating craft above a grand exhibition, we may hear the faint echo of those machines of the sky. Were they myths? Were they dreams? Or were they the lost inheritance of a civilization that once soared where we are only beginning to climb? The sky holds no answer now, only the silence of forgotten engines, the vanishing of giants. Across the annals of myth and folklore, one motif stands taller than most: the giants. They stride through Norse sagas, loom in biblical tales, and haunt the folk songs of the steppes. To the Tartarian mystery, these figures are more than allegory. They are thought to be flesh and blood remnants of a people erased, part of a lineage said to have walked beside ordinary humans, but with stature and strength that set them apart. In the whispers of Tartaria, giants become not just monsters of story, but ancestors of a lost empire. Mainstream history, for its part, recognizes the cultural richness of giant legends. Every continent has its versions. The Jotun of Scandinavia, the Nephilim of the Old Testament, the Daityas of India, the Bogatyrs of Russian epic poetry. Archaeologists, however, point to natural explanations. In some cases, giant skeletons once discovered turned out to be mastodon bones, misidentified by early diggers. In others, exaggerations of warrior strength transformed into literal height over centuries of oral storytelling. The tallest known humans, Robert Wadlow in the 20th century, who grew to nearly 9 feet, show us that exceptional size is possible but rare, usually caused by medical conditions. Scholars still debate whether repeated global traditions of giants reflect collective imagination or distant echoes of real encounters. Yet fringe accounts persist. In the 19th century, American newspapers from New York to California carried sensational stories of giant skeletons unearthed in burial mounds. Some claimed heights of 12 feet, with double rows of teeth. While many of these reports were later dismissed as hoaxes or journalistic flourishes, the sheer number of them stokes suspicion among enthusiasts. In Siberia and Central Asia, too, legends linger of giant warriors tied to Tartaria, some said to have been buried beneath ancient kurgans, mounds that dot the steppes like mute sentinels. There is also a quirky anecdote from Russian folklore. The hero Svyatogor, a giant knight who strides across the earth but feels his strength waning as he lies down to rest. In epic songs, he sometimes passes his might to smaller successors, an allegory, perhaps, for a race of giants giving way to ordinary humanity. Or was this an encrypted memory of a literal passing of power from a vanished people to their descendants? The architectural record fuels the speculation. Doorways in old palaces sometimes stand improbably high. Staircases rise in steps larger than comfortable for modern legs. Were these simply stylistic choices, or were they practical, scaled for bodies taller than ours? Fringe researchers point to oversized chairs, vast hearths, and immense arches, reading them as clues of giant inhabitants. Mainstream architects counter that monumental scale has always been a tool of human design, meant to inspire awe rather than accommodate actual proportions. Scholars still debate whether such features are evidence of forgotten residents, or simply artistry. The overlap with Tartaria comes from timing. Maps that once labelled the steppes as Tartary also carried notes of unusual peoples. Here dwell the Tartars, strong of body, some cartographers scrawled. Early travellers spoke of men who towered head and shoulders above others, their armour heavier, their horses larger. Were these exaggerations intended to make distant lands sound exotic, or were they the last glimpses of a people who faded into legend? If giants once walked, what happened to them? Theories abound. Some claim natural disaster, mud floods, cataclysm, famine, wiped them out. Others suggest integration. The giants bred with smaller humans, their bloodlines diluted but still leaving traces in occasional extraordinary height. And to the most conspiratorial theory whispers that they were deliberately erased, their bones destroyed or hidden by institutions unwilling to rewrite the story of human history. And so the giants of Tartaria linger like shadows at the edge of vision. We see them in sagas, in folk songs, in exaggerated reports of skeletons and armour. We feel them in the oversized arches of old architecture, in the mounds that dot the Eurasian plains. Were they real beings of flesh and bone, or metaphors made physical by imagination? Perhaps both. Perhaps myth is memory refracted, and the giants are echoes of a time when humanity's scale, whether literal or cultural, was far grander than it is today. Buried cities, mudflood mysteries. Imagine walking through the old quarter of a European city. The cobblestones glisten with rain, and narrow streets twist toward a cathedral that has stood for centuries. But then you notice something odd. Windows half buried below the current street level, their arches sunk into the earth. A doorway that once opened to a bustling street now reveals only a wall of dirt. In some buildings, whole first floors lie beneath the ground, converted into basements. Officials will tell us this is the result of centuries of road raising, rebuilding, and gradual accumulation of soil. Yet, in the lore of Tartaria, this is evidence of something else entirely, the mudflood. The mudflood theory is one of the most provocative threads tied to Tartarian legend. It claims that, not long ago, perhaps as recently as the 18th or 19th century, a global cataclysm swept over the world, burying cities in a sudden tide of mud and sediment. Entire civilizations, technologies, and histories were swallowed in a single stroke, leaving only their upper stories visible above the new ground. According to this view, we are not living atop ruins thousands of years old, but walking daily through the remains of a silenced empire. Mainstream geology offers other explanations. The Earth is full of processes that shift soil, landslides, floods, earthquakes, gradual urban build-up. Cities like Rome and Istanbul are layered with centuries of habitation, one level built upon another. Archaeologists excavate through strata that clearly show gradual accumulation, not sudden disaster. And yet, anomalies remain. In St. Petersburg, a city officially founded in 1703, many of the grandest palaces and government buildings already appear partially submerged within a century of their construction. How could newly built architecture so quickly sink below ground? Scholars still debate whether this was the result of swampy foundations, poor urban planning, or something more unusual. The quirky details fuel suspicion. Across Moscow, Paris, and Prague, one can find half-buried windows, now serving as basement ventilation. In North America, particularly in frontier towns of the 19th century, photographs show grand brick buildings with street-level entrances that within decades are sunken below sidewalks. Enthusiasts ask, were these really mistakes of civil engineering, or do they hint at an event too disruptive to fit into official timelines? Consider also the global nature of the phenomenon. Star forts in India, castles in Japan, mansions in Buenos Aires all show traces of buried foundations. Was this parallel development or global catastrophe? The mudflood theory argues that an event of planetary scope reset civilizations, wiping away Tartaria in the process. Then there are the folk tales. In Siberia, elders speak of a great sinking earth that consumed villages. In Central Europe, songs recall a night when the land itself seemed to slide, swallowing homes and towers. Were these exaggerations of local floods, or echoes of a larger memory? Mainstream scientists remain unconvinced. They point out that not a single layer of soil corresponding to a global mudflood has been identified in the geological record. Catastrophes leave signatures: ash from volcanic eruptions, silt from tsunamis, layers of ice melt. None show evidence of a worldwide mud deluge in recent centuries. Yet, here is the paradox: the visible buildings do not lie. Their half-buried windows, their sunken arches, are undeniable. Scholars still debate whether these are urban quirks of centuries of habitation or signs of something that does not fit within our neat chronology. The mudflood idea, quirky as it seems, serves a deeper purpose in the Tartarian mythos. It offers a mechanism, a reason why we might live among ruins without realizing it. It explains why evidence of a super-civilization would be hidden in plain sight, its grandeur cut off at the knees, buried beneath layers of earth we now walk upon. And so, when we look at a basement window glowing dimly below street level, we might ask ourselves, is this merely an architectural oddity? Or is it the last visible trace of a world swept away in silence, a Tartarian city half buried beneath our own? Language of towers and bells. Across the great cities of Eurasia, and indeed across much of the world, rise towers that seem to pierce the heavens. Slender spires crowned with gilded domes, bell towers casting their notes across valleys, minarets spiralling skyward, cathedral turrets bristling against the sky. Officially, these are the symbols of faith: churches, mosques, temples, their architecture shaped by devotion. But within the narrative of Tartaria, these towers are remembered as something else, a language of power, frequency, and resonance, carrying knowledge of a science now forgotten. Mainstream history reminds us that bell towers served very practical functions. They marked time in an age before wristwatches, called villagers to worship, and warned of fire or invasion. The bells themselves were works of metallurgical mastery. The Tsar bell in Moscow, cast in the 1730s, weighs over 200 tons, though it cracked before ever being rung. The great bell of Mingun in Burma, the Pumarin in Vienna, the massive bourdon of Notre Dame. These are marvels of craft, their deep notes rolling like thunder across landscapes. But beyond their practical use, the sheer obsession with monumental bells remains striking. Why invest such colossal effort into sound? Scholars still debate whether the symbolic explanations, the voice of God, or the community's heart, fully account for the scale and engineering. Fringe theorists add a curious twist. They argue that these towers and bells were not merely religious ornaments, but machines of resonance designed to harness and transmit energy. Domes clad in copper or gold, spires tipped with metal, bells vibrating at precise frequencies. Together, these might have formed a global grid, drawing power from the atmosphere itself. The idea is fanciful, yet strangely compelling. Consider Nikola Tesla in the early 1900s, experimenting with his war, Dencliffe Tower claiming that the earth and air could conduct limitless power. Enthusiasts ask, was Tesla rediscovering Tartarian principles, knowledge once encoded in the very skyline of our cities? A quirky anecdote emerges from Russia. Some villagers once believed that bells could banish storms, their vibrations disrupting thunderclouds. In parts of Central Europe, bells were rung to heal the sick, their tones said to realign the body. Even in Catholic tradition, baptizing a bell with holy water was believed to give it power over demons. Were these purely spiritual beliefs, or half-remembered knowledge of acoustic influence? The architecture itself feeds the speculation. Across continents, towers and domes follow strikingly similar proportions. The onion domes of Moscow, the minarets of Samarkand, the Renaissance spires of Italy, the colonial churches of Latin America, all echo each other. To mainstream scholars, this is a story of diffusion, styles migrating with conquest and trade. To Tartarian seekers, it looks more like a code, a shared architectural language pointing to a single origin. Scholars still debate whether such similarities arise from convergent design or a lost unifying blueprint. Consider also how sound interacts with space. Step into the Hagia Sophia of Istanbul or the cathedrals of Cologne and clap your hands. The echoes seem to shimmer, hanging in the air far longer than expected. Was this merely artistry of acoustics for worship? Or was it designed to amplify resonance, to create vibrational fields? Modern scientists know that certain frequencies can alter mood, even health. Could Tartarian towers and bells have once tuned entire cities like instruments, harmonizing human life with invisible forces? Mainstream archaeology provides one undeniable fact. These structures exist in staggering numbers, often built with precision far exceeding the tools we believe their builders had. The Great Mosque of Samarra in Iraq once boasted a spiral minaret rising 52 meters. The Ivan the Great Bell Tower in Moscow, completed in 1600, soared over the Kremlin at a height that dominated the skyline. These were not incidental flourishes. They were colossal investments, commanding entire populations' labour. And so, we return to the idea of language. Towers and bells may well have spoken in ways we no longer understand. Perhaps their language was spiritual, binding communities with ritual sound. Perhaps it was technological, a hum of frequencies lost to our deafened ears. Or perhaps, as is so often the case in history, it was both, a merging of faith and science, of symbol and function. Today, the bells still toll, their voices carrying across rivers and valleys, but if we listen carefully, we may hear in them not just a call to prayer, but a faint echo of Tartaria's forgotten language of resonance. Chronology rewritten. To understand Tartaria, one must confront an uncomfortable question. What if the very timeline of history, the scaffold upon which all our knowledge rests, is flawed? The suspicion is not new. For centuries, scholars have debated the reliability of ancient chronologies, the accuracy of calendars, and the authenticity of manuscripts. Yet in modern times, no figure has shaken the framework quite like Anatoly Fomenko, the Russian mathematician who, in the late 20th century, proposed a radical revision of history itself. Mainstream chronology, largely stabilized in the 16th and 17th centuries, traces back through careful study of classical texts, archaeological strata, astronomical records, and radiocarbon dating. We are taught that Rome fell in the 5th century, that the Middle Ages stretched for 1,000 years, and that modernity began in the Renaissance. But Fomenko and his colleagues in the New Chronology movement argue that much of this scaffolding is built on fragile ground. They claim entire centuries, sometimes entire millennia, were invented, duplicated, or misdated. According to their work, many ancient events are not ancient at all, but reflections of medieval or even early modern history, duplicated by error or design. Within this framework, Tartaria gains a startling prominence. If traditional chronology is compressed, then Tartaria might not be a shadowy medieval frontier, but a civilization flourishing in far more recent times, perhaps surviving into the 17th, 18th, or even 19th century. Fomenko suggests that empires we consider separate may in fact be the same, seen through distorted mirrors of time. The Mongol Empire, the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, even the biblical kingdoms, he claims, are versions of a single imperial narrative, rewritten and renamed. Scholars still debate whether his theories are bold innovation, eccentric folly, or deliberate provocation. One quirky detail in Fomenko's method is his use of astronomy. He analysed ancient eclipses recorded in chronicles and compared them with modern astronomical software. In some cases, he argued, the recorded dates do not align with traditional chronologies, but with far later ones. To him, this proves the timeline has been stretched. To mainstream historians, it proves only that early scribes sometimes misrecorded what they saw. The debate remains heated. Consider also the curious gaps in historical record. For centuries, vast portions of Russia and Central Asia left few detailed chronicles, despite their size and population. When records do appear, they are often filtered through foreign eyes, Arab geographers, Jesuit missionaries, European travellers. Enthusiasts of Tartaria argue that this absence is deliberate, the result of erasure or rewriting. Official history, they claim, compressed Tartaria out of existence by folding its story into others. There is precedent for such revisions. The medieval monk Joseph Justus Scaliger, often called the father of modern chronology, relied heavily on textual comparisons rather than physical evidence. Later, his methods were refined, but the foundation remained literary. Could errors in those early centuries of scholarship have snowballed into the rigid timeline we now defend? Scholars still debate whether chronology is a stable science or a patchwork vulnerable to distortion. The implications are unsettling. If centuries were invented, then entire civilizations, Tartaria among them, could have been misplaced in time. What we think of as ancient could be early modern. What we think of as medieval could be Renaissance. Our sense of progress, of human development from primitive to advanced, could itself be a mirage. And yet, even as mainstream historians dismiss Fomenko's grand claims, they acknowledge kernels of truth. Chronology is fragile. Ancient manuscripts often contradict one another. Dating methods have margins of error. Translations can shift meaning. It would not take much, a few misplaced centuries, a duplicated empire, for an entire civilization to slip through the cracks. The Tartarian narrative thrives in these cracks. It asks us to imagine that what we call history may be as much construction as discovery, as much invention as memory. Perhaps the reason Tartaria feels both familiar and absent is because it has been folded into other stories. its timeline cut, its legacy scattered. And so we arrive at an unsettling thought. If history itself has been rewritten, then perhaps Tartaria never disappeared at all. Perhaps it has only been misplaced, hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to recognize its true place in time. Architecture out of place. Walk through almost any old city, from Edinburgh to Istanbul, Delhi to San Francisco, and you will see them. Impossible buildings, immense stone blocks stacked with precision, arches that span distances wider than modern engineers would comfortably attempt without steel, domes that seem to defy gravity, and everywhere, ornamentation, delicate scrollwork, intricate carvings, towering columns that appear less like the work of masons and more like the product of machines. These structures are usually credited to the Renaissance, the Baroque, or the Gothic imagination, but within the Tartarian narrative they are reinterpreted as relics, not of the cultures we know, but of a forgotten super-civilization whose architectural language lingers in our cities like fossils embedded in stone. Take the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg, begun in 1754. Officially, it was the crowning project of Bartolomeo Rastrelli, an Italian architect in Russian service. Yet even by the standards of the time, its scale and execution seem otherworldly. 600 rooms, 300 metres long, decorated with an excess of detail. Could such a building have risen in a swampy frontier capital barely 50 years old, at a time when Russia's engineering core was still in its infancy? Official history insists yes. The Tartarian interpretation suspects otherwise, that the palace may have been repurposed, renovated, or built upon the foundations of something older, perhaps something inherited. Or consider the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., begun in 1793. Its neoclassical dome, columns, and pediments draw on the language of Rome. Yet, as Tartarian enthusiasts point out, the young republic lacked the heavy machinery we now associate with moving multi-ton stones and raising domes of such size. To skeptics, this is no mystery. Wooden scaffolds, pulleys, and skilled labour says, "Office." To believers, it is an echo of a deeper architectural inheritance, a technology we no longer fully grasp. Scholars still debate whether our ancestors underestimated their own resourcefulness, or whether we overestimate the uniqueness of our own tools. The quirky details often sit in plain sight. Fireplaces far too large for the climates in which they appear, windows that extend beneath current street level, as if built for a different ground, enormous doors and gateways, so vast one wonders what beings they were meant to welcome. The narrative grows. These were not mere design choices, but practical necessities of a civilization with different proportions, different technologies, different needs. Take the star forts, whose geometry we glimpsed earlier. Across the world, from Verona to Nagasaki, they appear vast, precise, mathematically perfect. Historians explain them as military innovations of the 16th century, designed to repel cannon fire. Yet the sheer number of them, the repetition of the same design across continents, raises questions. Were they truly defensive? Or were they part of a global energy network, as some Tartarian lore suggests, devices that collected and distributed power, disguised in the language of fortification? Scholars still debate whether their global uniformity is coincidence, colonial influence, or evidence of a single vanished template. Mainstream archaeology does not deny that architecture can be out of place. Consider Baalbek in Lebanon, where stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons form the base of a Roman temple. Even today, cranes struggle to move such masses. Or the Kailasa temple at Ellora in India, carved downward out of solid rock in the 8th century, a feat so audacious that even modern engineers marvel at the logistics. These examples are accepted as part of human genius, rare outliers that stretch our understanding of what was possible. Yet for the Tartarian imagination, they are not outliers at all, but fragments of a global pattern, hints of a shared capability we have lost, Even in the New World, the theme emerges. 19th century photographs of American frontier towns show ornate brick and stone buildings rising in places barely settled. Chicago, San Francisco, Salt Lake City all seem to leap from wilderness to metropolises crowned with domes and towers in less than a generation. How could pioneers, still battling the elements, produce such grandeur so quickly? Officially, these were the results of ambition, immigrant craftsmen, and borrowed European designs. In Tartarian lore, they are simply inheritances, structures already there, lightly adapted to new uses. The fascination with architecture out of place lies not only in the buildings themselves, but in the silence that surrounds them. Tour guides can list dates and architects, but rarely do they answer the deeper why. Why so much ornament in an age when survival itself was precarious? Why build with such permanence when timber sufficed? Why repeat the same motifs across continents? Scholars still debate whether these are the convergences of style, the triumphs of forgotten engineers, or the fingerprints of something greater. As we pass beneath their arches, as we gaze up at domes that rival the sky, the buildings themselves whisper possibilities. They are stone witnesses, standing silently as generations reinterpret them. Whether Renaissance masterpieces, colonial borrowings, or Tartarian fossils, they endure, haunting us with the suspicion that we are living not only among the ruins of our own ancestors, but among the borrowed monuments of a world whose name has nearly vanished. Machines of the sky, stories of Tartaria often take flight, literally. Amid the domes, the star forts, and the colossal masonry, whispers of a technological inheritance drift upward into the clouds, machines of the sky. The narrative imagines a civilization so advanced that air travel, free energy, and atmospheric engineering were not futuristic dreams, but ordinary aspects of daily life. Like ghostly contrails across the historical record, these ideas appear in scattered fragments, paintings, myths, and anomalous inventions, leaving us to wonder what, if anything, they reveal. Consider the legends of airships that surfaced across North America in the late 19th century. Newspapers from Texas, California, and even the Midwest published accounts of mysterious craft drifting overhead, massive cigar-shaped vessels, sometimes with wings or sails, piloted by human-like figures who waved down at astonished farmers. The great airship flap of 1896-1897 is usually dismissed as journalistic whimsy, a fever of invention during an age of rapid technological change. Yet Tartarian lore embraces these sightings, reinterpreting them as the final appearances of machines once common, remnants of a knowledge that lingered in the hands of a few long after the great civilization had collapsed. Scholars still debate whether these were pranks, hallucinations, or genuine glimpses of something lost. Mainstream history offers parallels that, while grounded, still carry an aura of wonder. In 1783, the Montgolfier brothers sent a hot air balloon skyward in France, thrilling crowds. By the mid-1800s, airships using hydrogen were lifting explorers above cities. The leap from earthbound civilization to skyborne dream happened quickly, within decades. Yet, Tartarian enthusiasts ask, was this truly a new invention, or the rediscovery of principles long forgotten? Why, after millennia of human ingenuity, did the skies suddenly fill with balloons and dirigibles as though a curtain had been drawn back? Quirky details feed the suspicion. Ancient frescoes and medieval manuscripts occasionally depict objects in the heavens that look suspiciously like machines, disc-like, spindle-shaped, or radiant with beams of light. Most scholars interpret these as allegories, symbols of divinity or celestial phenomena. Yet in the Tartarian imagination, they become literal artifacts of memory, aircraft painted not as myth but as fact, remembered dimly through religious language. And then there are the towers, cathedrals with metal spires, topped by spheres or finials, connected by a lattice of wires in old engravings. Historians call them lightning rods, marvels of electrical safety invented by Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s. But in Tartarian lore, they were far more, components of a wireless energy grid, harvesting the natural power of the atmosphere. Nikola Tesla's experiments at the dawn of the 20th century, especially his Wardenclyffe Tower, are often cited as modern echoes of this older mastery. Tesla himself once remarked that he was tapping into the wheelwork of nature, extracting energy directly from the environment. Scholars still debate whether his claims represented real potential or the dream of a genius ahead of his time. Even the great world's fairs, which we touched upon earlier, are drawn into the story. Photographs from the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago show immense electric towers, fountains of light, and illuminated boulevards said to rival modern Las Vegas. Officially, these were powered by Edison and Westinghouse generators. But the Tartarian narrative questions how such fragile technology could create such enduring brilliance, arguing instead that the exhibitions tapped into existing infrastructure, perhaps remnants of the Tartarian grid, temp, or rarely reactivated before being dismantled or hidden. In the mainstream record, the skies have always been a source of ambition. From Da Vinci's sketches of flying machines to the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903, humanity has long dreamed of mastering the air. The Tartarian story inverts this arc. Instead of progress, it sees decline. Instead of invention, it sees fragments of rediscovery. Our dirigibles and airplanes are not steps forward, but pale imitations of machines that once crossed the globe with ease. To the rational historian, such claims remain untenable. No surviving machines, no blueprints, no unambiguous evidence supports the existence of Tartarian airships or energy towers. What remains are curious alignments, suggestive patterns, and anomalies open to interpretation. Scholars still debate whether we are simply imposing our own technological yearnings onto the past, seeing aircraft and electricity where our ancestors saw only storms, stars, and divine fire. Yet the allure endures. The idea of machines of the sky captures our imagination because it suggests a world where the boundary between earth and heaven was thinner, where humanity's genius soared beyond the limitations we now assume. To walk beneath old spires, to stand in the shadow of domes crowned with iron and copper, is to wonder, were these simply ornaments, or were they antennae, beacons, the grounded remnants of a civilization that once commanded the skies? Silk roads of power. The Silk Road is usually remembered as a thread of commerce, a vast artery connecting east and west with spices, silk, porcelain, and ideas. It conjures camels trudging across deserts, caravans glittering with precious goods, and the rise of cities like Samarkand, Kashgar, and Xi'an. Yet, within the Tartarian story, the Silk Road is imagined as more than just a trade route. It becomes the living bloodstream of a forgotten empire, a network of power and communication that once bound much of the world under a different order. Mainstream historians acknowledge the Silk Road's immense influence. Originating during the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BCE, it facilitated not just the exchange of goods, but also of religion, science, and art. By the medieval period, it stretched thousands of miles, a patchwork of roads, rivers, and steppe trails linking Europe to China. Marco Polo's 13th century travels famously illuminated its wonders for Europe. Yet Tartarian lore reframes this highway of exchange as evidence of something deeper, a super-civilization not only trading across the world, but perhaps controlling the very terms of exchange itself. The quirky details are often geographical. Old maps sometimes place Tartaria across enormous swathes of Central and Northern Asia, a vast continuum that overlapped directly with Silk Road routes. To believers, this overlap is no coincidence. The great caravanserais, those fortress-like resting stations for traders, may have been more than simple waypoints. Some suggest they were once hubs in a sophisticated system of logistics, surveillance, or even energy distribution, nodes of a network far more deliberate than mere commerce. Then there is the matter of architecture. Along the Silk Road, one finds minarets rising like beacons, intricate tiled domes, and strange polygonal citadels whose original builders are sometimes lost to time. The great Kalyan minaret in Bukhara, for instance, built in 1127, is said to have astonished even Genghis Khan, who spared it while burning the city around it. In Tartarian lore, such structures are interpreted not just as religious or defensive monuments, but as part of a larger grid, a visual and material echo of an order that organized space on a continental scale. Scholars still debate whether the Silk Road's architectural marvels represent isolated flourishes or signs of deeper coordination across cultures. Stories of hidden technology persist as well. Some accounts describe fire wagons or wheeled devices that could carry goods without beasts of burden, suggesting either advanced carts or perhaps even early mechanized transport. These appear mostly in folklore, often dismissed as exaggerations, yet in the Tartarian imagination they are survivals of memory, hints that along the Silk Road there once moved machines we can scarcely envision. Even the cultural transmissions raise questions. Paper, printing, and gunpowder are said to have travelled westward from China. Medical knowledge and astronomy moved east. But within this exchange lies a strange symmetry, as though knowledge was not merely diffused, but systematically circulated, curated, and balanced. Could there have been a coordinating hand, an empire with reach subtle enough to avoid leaving behind its name, but powerful enough to orchestrate flows of wisdom? Mainstream records do mention powers that controlled or taxed the Silk Road. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors is often credited with creating a Pax Mongolica, a century of relative stability that allowed caravans to move more freely. The Yuan dynasty in China and the Ilkhanate in Persia were both part of this enormous Mongol web. Yet, Tartarian lore sometimes folds the Mongols into its mythos, suggesting that the so-called Mongol Empire was merely one fragment of the greater Tartaria, misremembered or deliberately mislabeled by later historians. Scholars still debate whether the Mongol conquests truly unified Eurasia, or if the image of a single empire was partly the work of later chroniclers, smoothing chaos into narrative. Quirky echoes linger in language too. In old texts, Tartars were not only fearsome horsemen, but sometimes portrayed as guardians of knowledge, moving swiftly across steppe routes like living messengers of empire. Even Marco Polo describes them with a mixture of awe and practicality, noting their speed and efficiency as couriers, carrying not just silk, but decrees and intelligence across thousands of miles. In Tartarian lore, these horsemen become something more. The human tendrils of a networked world, predecessors of the modern internet, riding flesh and blood circuits across a connected globe. At its heart, the Silk Road of Tartaria is imagined less as a marketplace and more as a nervous system. Goods travelled, yes, but so did stories, faiths, technologies, and rumours of power. To stand in the ruins of an old caravanserai, to walk beneath the tiled archways of Samarkand, or to imagine the clang of bells along a camel's neck, is to sense a rhythm of exchange far deeper than commerce. Perhaps it was commerce alone, or perhaps it was something else, a superstructure of influence whose name we have forgotten, but whose roads still cut across deserts, mountains, and memory itself. Suppressors of memory. If Tartaria existed, if there truly was a vast empire that once stretched across Eurasia, boasting technologies, architectures, and networks that rival anything in our modern imagination, then one question becomes unavoidable. Why do so few of us know about it today? This is where the story takes a darker turn into the territory of erasure, censorship, and the deliberate rewriting of history. Mainstream history certainly acknowledges that victors write the record. Ancient libraries have burned, most famously at Alexandria, erasing entire schools of thought in a single night of fire. Empires have redacted their predecessors, chiseling names off monuments, recarving statues, or refounding cities atop ruins. But in Tartarian lore, this process of erasure becomes global, systematic, and intentional. It is said that powerful nations and institutions conspired not merely to conquer Tartaria, but to obliterate the memory of its existence altogether. Theories abound. One centres on the 19th century, when maps still labelled vast swathes of northern Asia as Tartary. Then, almost overnight, the word disappeared from atlases, replaced by Siberia, Russian Empire, or Central Asia. For Tartaria enthusiasts, this cartographic vanishing act is suspicious. How could a label so widely used for centuries suddenly evaporate from academic discourse? Was it simply an outdated term abandoned as geography became more precise? Or was it a conscious campaign to erase the trace of a civilization? Scholars still debate whether the disappearance of Tartaria from maps was purely a matter of evolving cartography or evidence of something more deliberate. Another theory places the blame at the feet of empires themselves, chiefly Russia, China, and the growing colonial powers of Europe. To fold Tartaria into their dominions, they had to scrub it from memory. The Russi, an empire, in particular, expanded eastward across Siberia during the 17th and 18th centuries, engulfing indigenous cultures and rewriting regional histories. By the 19th century, official Russian narratives described Siberia as a wild frontier, gradually civilized under Moscow's hand. For Tartaria believers, this is propaganda, a conquest disguised as benevolence, achieved by effacing an older, more advanced order that had already flourished there. Quirky evidence sometimes offered is the phenomenon of phantom maps and phantom time. A few fringe researchers argue that whole centuries may have been fabricated or duplicated in our calendars, an idea famously championed by Anatoly Fomenko, who suggested the medieval period was largely invented. In this framework, Tartaria didn't vanish, it was simply displaced in time, hidden by restructured chronologies. The Great Fire of Moscow in 1812, for instance, is interpreted by some as the destruction of Tartarian architecture, masked as wartime collateral. But if we look closer, there are mainstream parallels. Consider the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, where colossal and ornate temporary structures were supposedly built in record time, only to vanish or be dismantled shortly afterward. Some Tartarian researchers argue these were not new creations at all, but appropriated Tartarian buildings, paraded before the world and then quietly erased. While mainstream historians emphasize industrial optimism and imperial showmanship, the sheer scale of these exhibitions does raise questions about the rapidity and disposability of their grandeur. The institutional side of the story points toward academia itself. Universities, history departments, and museums, trusted guardians of our collective knowledge, are accused of complicity in burying Tartaria. To skeptics, this is a conspiratorial leap. Academic consensus, after all, is built on peer review, evidence, and replication. Yet even within mainstream scholarship, we find admissions of bias, colonial filtering, and the selective survival of records. The archives of empires are rarely neutral. What was preserved reflected what rulers wanted remembered. What was destroyed reflected what they feared. One particularly curious detail is the fate of the Scythians, those enigmatic steppe peoples described by Herodotus and later chroniclers. Archaeologists have uncovered their burial mounds, filled with golden ornaments, fine textiles, and elaborate horse trappings. Yet despite their sophistication, Scythians are often framed as semi-barbaric nomads rather than the heirs of a larger civilizational complex. Could this be a subtle example of how powerful cultures are reframed as primitive to better suit dominant narratives? In Tartarian lore, the Scythians are not barbarians, but fragments of the forgotten empire. Scholars still debate whether the Scythians were truly nomadic, or whether their cultural remains hint at a larger, more urbanized system now hidden from view. If suppression was real, the question of motive lingers. Why erase Tartaria? The answers offered are unsettling. Some say it was to consolidate national power. By erasing a shared super-civilization, empires could claim credit for progress and invention. Others suggest a deeper conspiracy, that Tartaria's technologies, especially in energy and architecture, threatened the emerging industrial order. To acknowledge them would undermine the narrative of linear progress from steam to electricity, coal to oil. By burying Tartaria, the story of modernity itself could proceed without contradiction. What's most haunting is how silence itself becomes evidence. When a term once common in maps, encyclopedias, and travelogues fades into obscurity, when great ruins are explained away as the work of primitive peoples, when elaborate legends are treated as mere curiosities, it raises the suspicion that something more lies beneath. Was Tartaria suppressed deliberately, or did it simply fall victim to history's usual tides, where only fragments survive and the rest are washed away? Perhaps both. For every library burned, there is a silence in our record. For every conquest, a name erased. If Tartaria was truly there, it may have been buried not just under mud and ruins, but beneath the weight of forgetting itself, carried out by those who stood to gain from our amnesia. Echoes in folk memory. If maps can be altered, if archives can be cleansed, there is one realm of history more stubborn: folk memory. Unlike parchment and paper, oral tradition is not so easily burned. Songs, legends, and fireside tales can carry fragments of lost civilizations across centuries, bypassing official censorship. If Tartaria was truly erased from maps and books, perhaps its ghost still lingers in the voices of villagers, in myths that refuse to die. Consider the Bylini, the epic poems of Russia. Sung for centuries by wandering bards, they recount larger-than-life heroes, battles, and vanished kingdoms. Characters like Ilya Muromets and Dobrynya Nikitich are said to have defended their lands against invading forces with impossible strength and wisdom. To mainstream scholars, these are archetypal warrior tales, Slavic echoes of Homeric myth. Yet to Tartarian enthusiasts, they feel like distorted memories of an advanced civilization, where heroes embody real leaders whose feats were later mythologized. Scholars still debate whether Bylini are purely folkloric creations or faint reflections of actual events now lost to the historical record. Steppe peoples across Central Asia tell similar tales. In Kazakh and Kyrgyz epics, we encounter stories of warriors riding across endless plains, carrying weapons that seem far ahead of their time. There are songs of cities with golden domes, of radiant towers gleaming on the horizon. These images align uncannily with the architectural motifs found in forgotten ruins. Fortresses shaped like stars, monumental stonework, and palatial halls beneath the earth. Could these be coincidences, or are we hearing fragments of a collective memory, preserved in rhythm and rhyme when ink and stone were obliterated? One quirky example comes from Siberian folklore. In certain Yakut stories, there are references to giants who taught the people how to build with stone and metal, who then mysteriously vanished. The people were left to wander, with only fragments of their teachers' wisdom. To ethnographers, these are origin myths, ways of explaining how metallurgy or masonry entered local traditions. But in the Tartarian lens, they are whispers of a civilizational transfer, from a superculture down to scattered survivors after catastrophe. Western Europe, too, holds its echoes. Medieval chronicles speak of Prester John, a mighty Christian king said to rule somewhere in the east, with cities of unmatched splendour. For centuries explorers hunted for his domain, convinced it was hidden beyond the steppes. When viewed through a Tartarian lens, Prester John is reimagined as a distorted memory of Tartaria itself, an empire pushed into the realm of myth as cartographers struggled to reconcile legend with geography. And then there are the fairy tales. In countless Slavic, Turkic and Mongolic stories, we find motifs of hidden kingdoms, golden palaces and subterranean cities. The Baba Yaga of Russian folklore, flying in her mortar and pestle, might be an echo of flight technology remembered only as magic. The Firebird, a radiant creature bringing light and power, could be a symbolic memory of energy sources now lost. Scholars still debate whether such symbols are mere fantasy or garbled echoes of technologies and landscapes from a forgotten past. Modern anthropologists often frame these stories as allegory, psychological projection, or cultural metaphor. But folklore has a peculiar resilience. It can outlive empires. When the Roman world collapsed, the Arthurian legends still carried fragments of a Celtic and Romanized Britain into the Middle Ages. When Troy fell, its memory survived in Homer's verses, long before archaeologists uncovered the ruins at Hisarlik. Folklore has, time and again, proven to be a vault of truth, half clouded but not empty. It is here that Tartaria refuses to die. Even if erased from textbooks, its spectre is alive in campfire songs, in the chants of shamans, in the riddles of storytellers. Children in small villages along the Volga or deep in Siberia may not speak of Tartaria by name, but their fairy tales, inherited from grandparents, are laced with imagery of towers, fortresses, and giants. If we listen closely, we hear a civilization remembered not through records, but through resonance. And resonance matters. When multiple cultures, spread across vast distances, retain similar myths of advanced ancestors, radiant cities, or sudden catastrophes, we are confronted with a mystery. Either these are coincidences, or they are cultural memories of something that once united vast lands before fracturing into pieces. For Tartaria believers, this is the strongest evidence of all, that even the most powerful suppressors cannot silence song. Science versus legend. At this point, our journey reaches the inevitable confrontation between the tales of Tartaria and the tools of modern science. Archaeologists, historians and engineers look at the same clues, the star forts, the buried basements, the improbable architecture, and often reach conclusions that diverge from those of folk memory and alternative history. This tension is not merely academic, it is a collision between worldviews. On one side, the guardians of established chronology. On the other, seekers convinced the mainstream has overlooked, or even suppressed, a forgotten truth. Mainstream archaeology points to incremental development. The domes and palaces of St. Petersburg, for instance, are understood as products of the 18th century, constructed under Peter the Great and his successors, who drew on Italian architects. The star forts are catalogued as military innovations of the Renaissance, spreading from Italy outward as cannon warfare reshaped Europe. To professionals, the mystery dissolves under the light of well-documented design manuals, trade records, and construction logs. Scholars still debate whether the spectacular speed of construction in certain capitals, sometimes whole districts rising in a single decade, was miraculous efficiency or evidence of something yet to be explained. Yet the counter-arguments remain striking. Alternative historians note how many of these buildings appear vastly older than their supposed birth certificates suggest. Weathering patterns on stone facades sometimes imply centuries of erosion. Some cathedrals and civic buildings look eerily alike across continents, Prague to Mumbai, Washington DC to Moscow, as though stamped from the same mould. To skeptics of the official record, such uniformity hints at a global template, perhaps inherited from a super-civilization rather than invented anew in each nation. Take the mudflood basements. Mainstream geology attributes them to urban development. As cities modernized, streets were raised, leaving older ground floors buried. But this explanation falters when the phenomenon appears in locations without such urban remodeling, or when entire stretches of cities seem submerged at once. Scholars still debate whether the so-called mudfloods were local quirks of city planning or evidence of a sudden worldwide catastrophe that rewrote the landscape in a single stroke. Then there is the matter of technology. To historians of science, free energy or atmospheric electricity remains speculative, outside the bounds of tested physics. They trace references to Tesla's work and church bells to cultural fascination with sound and electromagnetism, but deny evidence of a global power grid in antiquity. And yet, the sheer number of legends describing sky machines, radiant cities, and harmonic towers gives pause. Could there have been technologies now lost, dismissed as myth because they do not fit into the evolutionary model of progress? Science, of course, has its triumphs. Radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and stratigraphy provide robust timelines for most known civilizations. Excavations in Siberia have unearthed Paleolithic tools dating back tens of thousands of years, but not machines or metal structures. The mainstream argues, if Tartaria had been as advanced as some claim, why is its material record not overwhelming? Why do we not find factories, machines, or written archives unmistakably pointing to a lost industrial age? The response from Tartarian enthusiasts often shifts the frame. They argue that the very absence of evidence is evidence of systematic erasure. Wars, fires, deliberate destruction, and rewritten history could have obliterated the traces. After all, the burning of the Library of Alexandria erased thousands of years of knowledge in a single act. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 destroyed irreplaceable manuscripts. History has repeatedly shown that fragile knowledge, however advanced, can vanish almost overnight. In this standoff, there is also a deeper philosophical question. Science depends on evidence that can be measured, tested, repeated. Legend thrives in ambiguity, in oral tradition, in symbols that resist quantification. Which do we privilege when reconstructing the past? Scholars still debate whether myth should be treated merely as metaphor or as a coded record of genuine events awaiting translation into historical terms. This is why Tartaria sits in such an unsettling place. It is not dismissed as pure fantasy because too many clues align across too many cultures, but nor is it embraced by the Academy because it lacks the hard bones of archaeological certainty. It is a ghost story standing at the gates of history, waiting for admission. And perhaps that is why its allure endures. Tartaria belongs to the twilight zone between science and legend, where imagination and evidence wrestle for control of memory. The quiet return. And so we arrive at the present day, where Tartaria, once erased from textbooks and dismissed as a phantom, resurfaces in the collective imagination, not through dusty archives or classroom lectures, but through the humming wires of the internet. Forums, videos, podcasts, and social media feeds form a patchwork of digital campfires where people gather to ask, what if? A decade ago, few outside of niche circles had even heard the word Tartaria. Today, it appears in documentaries, discussion threads, and increasingly in the mainstream press, often framed as a curiosity or conspiracy. Yet the persistence of the story is itself remarkable. What could have remained a footnote has grown into a sprawling grassroots investigation as ordinary people sift through old maps, trade photographs of star forts, and analyse the mysterious World's Fair buildings as if they were detectives in a case abandoned by official investigators. The appeal lies partly in the gaps of history. We live in an age where information seems infinite, yet questions remain unanswered. Why do so many grand civic buildings of the 19th century look far older than their claimed dates of construction? Why are their entire floors buried beneath modern city streets? Why do maps from Europe's golden age casually label enormous swathes of land as Tartaria without explanation? These are not fabricated artifacts. They are real, verifiable objects. The mystery arises from how they fit or fail to fit into the narrative we have inherited. Equally compelling is the aesthetic resonance. Tartaria is not just a theory, it is a vision. A civilization of soaring domes, endless avenues, radiant towers, and technologies that harness nature rather than consuming it. In an era grappling with climate change and technological anxiety, the idea of a society that mastered energy and architecture with grace feels like both a critique of our world and a dream of a better one. Mainstream scholars respond with caution. They remind us that history has long been weaponized, that conspiracy theories can spiral into dangerous places. They note that legends like Tartaria often grow in the soil of disenchantment. When people feel cut off from their roots, they turn to stories of hidden pasts to restore meaning. Scholars still debate whether this movement is best understood as a harmless curiosity, a fringe challenge to orthodoxy, or a genuine signal that something important has been overlooked. But beyond academia, the story has taken on a life of its own. Artists sketch imagined Tartarian skylines, writers spin tales of forgotten empires, architects study the resonance of domes and the geometry of cathedrals with fresh wonder. Even those who dismiss Tartaria as fantasy admit it has sparked a wave of creativity, a hunger to look closer at the world around us. A half-buried window on a city street, a weathered star-shaped fort in a meadow, an ancient bell ringing with uncanny power. These are no longer background details. They are breadcrumbs leading into mystery. And perhaps that is Tartaria's true gift. Not as a solved puzzle, but as an invitation to look again, to imagine again, to ask what might have been erased and why. To accept that the world is layered with histories both visible and invisible, some neatly catalogued, others waiting patiently in silence for curious eyes. In the end, Tartaria's quiet return is not only about the past, it is about the present, our longing for connection, our suspicion of easy narratives, our restless search for something larger than ourselves. Like a ghost whose presence is felt though never fully seen, Tartaria drifts between legend and memory, refusing to vanish. And in its persistence, it reminds us history is never final. It is alive, shifting, always waiting to be rediscovered. Conclusion. Across 15 sections, we have traced the whispers of a lost empire through maps, ruins, myths, and the debates of scholars. Tartaria may never emerge as a proven civilization in the strict sense, but its resonance is undeniable. It stands as a mirror, reflecting our fascination with grandeur, our suspicion of erasure, and our longing for a more enchanted past. Whether Tartaria was a vast super-civilization, a misinterpreted chapter of Eurasian history, or simply a myth woven from fragments, its endurance speaks to a deeper truth. Human beings do not live by facts alone. We live by stories, those we inherit, those we contest, and those we rediscover. Tartaria is one such story, and in chasing it, we are reminded that the past is never as settled as we imagine. So, as we close, perhaps the forgotten empire is not gone after all. Perhaps it survives, here, in the questions we ask, in the mysteries we guard, and in the quiet belief that history still holds secrets waiting to be found.